Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to cover those up. The flight attendant's voice carried the polite authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Jessica Martinez gestured diplomatically toward Captain Riley Chen's neck, where burn scars crawled up from her collar like abstract art etched in damaged skin. Riley didn't look up from her boarding pass. At 28, she carried herself with the controlled precision of someone who had learned to navigate a world that judged her by appearances. The scars extended from her jawline down past her collar, a topographic map of trauma that told a story she rarely shared. "Excuse me," Riley's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations, though few would recognize that authority in a young woman wearing civilian clothes. The first-class cabin of United Flight 847 buzzed with the entitled energy of business travelers and luxury passengers. Riley had paid full price for Seat 2A, using her military disability compensation, money that came with memories she'd rather forget. "We've had some passenger complaints," Jessica continued, her corporate smile growing more strained, "about your visible injuries. It's making other travelers uncomfortable during their dining experience." Riley felt the familiar burn of humiliation that had nothing to do with her physical scars. She had faced Taliban fighters in Afghanistan, commanded Apache helicopter missions under enemy fire, and survived an aircraft crash that had killed 3 of her crew members. But civilian prejudice still had the power to reduce her to a damaged object of pity or disgust. "These aren't injuries," Riley said quietly, her fingers unconsciously moving to touch the scarred skin. "They're evidence of survival." Behind her she could hear the whispered conversations of other first-class passengers. A businessman in an expensive suit leaned toward his colleague, speaking just loudly enough to be heard. "Military. Probably. You'd think they'd do something about that before inflicting it on the rest of us." A woman with diamonds that caught the overhead lights shook her head sympathetically. "Poor thing. But really, there should be some consideration for other passengers' comfort." Riley had heard variations of these comments in restaurants, hotels, and shopping centers across the country. Her scars made people uncomfortable because they were a visible reminder of violence, of the price some people paid for others' freedom. "Ma'am, we can move you to a premium economy seat," Jessica offered, pulling out a tablet to check availability. "Same level of service, just a more appropriate environment." Riley looked around the first-class cabin at faces that had turned away from her, conversations that had hushed when she passed. These were people who had never missed a meal, never heard incoming mortar fire, never held a dying soldier in their arms while calling for extraction that might never come. "I paid for this seat," Riley said simply. "I'll keep." But even as she spoke, she could see the flight attendant's determination. The complaints had been made, the management decision reached. Riley Chen, decorated Army helicopter pilot and Medal of Honor recipient, was about to be removed from first class because her scars made wealthy passengers uncomfortable during their pre-flight champagne service. The walk of shame was about to begin. "Ma'am, I understand your position, but we have a policy about passenger comfort," Jessica said, her voice taking on the rehearsed firmness of corporate training. "I'm going to have to insist that you relocate." Riley gathered her small carry-on bag, a military-issue pack that had survived 3 deployments, and stood with the measured movements of someone who had learned to control her reactions under pressure. She wouldn't give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break. As she moved down the aisle, escorted by Jessica like a criminal being removed from the scene of a crime, Riley felt the weight of every stare. A young mother pulled her child closer as they passed, as if scarring were contagious. An elderly man studied his newspaper with sudden intensity, unwilling to make eye contact. "This is ridiculous," whispered a voice from behind. Riley turned to see a woman in her 50s, dressed in a flight attendant uniform with senior stripes. "That's Captain Riley Chen. She's a war hero." Jessica paused, glancing back uncertainly. "Sarah, please don't interfere. Management has made their decision." But Sarah stepped into the aisle, blocking their progress. "Do you know who you're removing from first class? That's the pilot who saved 43 soldiers during the Kandahar evacuation. She's got a Medal of Honor." Riley felt her chest tighten. She had specifically chosen civilian clothes and avoided displaying any military identification to prevent exactly this kind of attention. Recognition brought questions she wasn't ready to answer. "Sarah, step aside," Jessica commanded, but her voice carried less certainty than before. She flew 3 rescue missions after her own helicopter was shot down. "Sarah," continued, her voice rising. "She pulled wounded soldiers out of a crash site while her own aircraft was burning around her." Other passengers were listening now, their whispered conversations falling silent as they processed this information. Riley saw their expressions shifting from disgust to confusion to something approaching shame. "Is this true?" asked the businessman who had made the earlier disparaging comment. Riley met his gaze steadily. "Medals don't make scars more acceptable to look at during dinner service," she said quietly. "If my appearance disturbs you now, it would disturb you regardless of what I've done." The businessman had the grace to look embarrassed. Around the cabin, other passengers were beginning to murmur among themselves, the atmosphere shifting as they realized what was happening. Through the partially open cockpit door, Riley caught a glimpse of the flight crew preparing for departure. The pilot was reviewing his checklist, his profile sharp against the instrument panel. Something about his posture, the way he held himself, triggered a memory that she couldn't quite place. "Ma'am, please," Jessica said, clearly uncomfortable with the developing situation. "We need to complete boarding." Riley nodded, understanding that this public recognition had only made things more complicated. Sarah meant well, but Riley had learned that being a decorated veteran didn't protect you from civilian prejudice. It just made the prejudice more embarrassing for everyone involved. "Lead the way," Riley said simply, following Jessica toward the back of the aircraft. As Riley walked toward the rear of the aircraft, her eyes involuntarily returned to the cockpit. The pilot was leaning over his instrument panel, and when he turned slightly to speak to his co-pilot, she caught a clearer view of his profile. Her breath caught. Captain Michael Torres. The name hit her like shrapnel from an IED explosion, bringing with it a flood of memories she had spent 3 years trying to manage through therapy and medication. 5 years ago, during the chaotic evacuation of Forward Operating Base Chapman, Riley had been piloting the lead Apache in a convoy of rescue helicopters. Phoenix had been the pilot of a damaged Chinook transport, trying to evacuate wounded personnel while under heavy enemy fire. Riley's memory crystallized with painful clarity. Phoenix's voice crackling over the radio, calm despite the fact that his aircraft was losing hydraulic fluid and taking small arms fire. "Angel 7, this is Phoenix 2. I've got wounded on board, but my bird's not going to make it to the extraction point." She had made a decision that violated every rule of engagement but saved 43 lives. Using her Apache as cover, she had guided Phoenix's damaged Chinook to an emergency landing zone, then coordinated the transfer of wounded personnel to other aircraft, while providing suppressing fire against enemy positions. The last time she had seen Michael Torres, he had been unconscious on a medical evacuation helicopter, his skull fractured from the crash landing that had saved his passengers but nearly killed him. Riley had flown cover for that medevac flight until her own Apache had been hit by a rocket-propelled grenade. She had awakened 6 weeks later in a military hospital in Germany, her face and neck a patchwork of burns and surgical repair. By the time she was stable enough to ask about other casualties, Phoenix had been transferred stateside for neurological rehabilitation. "Ma'am," Jessica's voice brought Riley back to the present. They had reached the economy section, where her new seat was located in the last row beside the lavatory. "Here we are. I hope you'll be more comfortable here." Riley settled into the narrow seat, her mind still processing the recognition. Michael Torres was alive, apparently recovered enough to return to flight status with a commercial airline. The man whose life she had helped save was now commanding the aircraft from which she had just been removed for having scarred. A young soldier in army dress uniform, seated across the aisle, had been watching the exchange with growing agitation. He stood as Jessica prepared to leave. "Ma'am," he said to the flight attendant, "I don't know what just happened up there, but that woman is Captain Riley Chen. She's got a Medal of Honor for what she did in Afghanistan." Jessica paused, clearly uncomfortable. "I understand that, but nothing," the soldier interrupted. "She's the reason half my unit made it home alive. Whatever complaints those people had, they can deal with it." Riley looked at the young soldier, probably 19 or 20, wearing ribbons that indicated recent deployment. "It's okay," she told him quietly. "This isn't your fight." But even as she spoke, she wondered what Phoenix would do if he realized she was on his air. Flight 8047 taxied toward the runway with mechanical precision, but Riley's attention was focused on the subtle vibrations she could feel through the aircraft's structure. Her years of military flying had given her an intimate understanding of aircraft systems, and something about the engine harmonics felt slightly off. The soldier across the aisle, his name tape read Martinez, was still clearly agitated about her treatment. "Captain Chen, ma'am, this is bullshit. My squad leader told us about what you did at Chapman. You should be up there in the cockpit, not stuck back here because some rich assholes can't handle looking at battle scars." "Language, soldier," Riley said with a slight smile. "And it's just Riley. I medically retired 2 years ago." "Ma'am, retired or not, you're still a captain to me." The aircraft accelerated down the runway, and Riley felt the familiar sensation of lift. But as they climbed through 10,000 feet, she noticed an irregular vibration in the port engine. Nothing dramatic, but definitely abnormal. Her concern deepened when she saw a flight attendant speaking urgently into her handset near the galley. The woman's expression was carefully controlled, but Riley recognized the look of someone receiving troubling information from the cockpit. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Torres speaking." Phoenix's voice came over the intercom, and Riley felt her pulse quicken at the familiar tone. "We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties that require our attention. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we assess the situation." The announcement was professionally delivered, but Riley caught the subtle stress markers in Phoenix's voice, the slightly elevated pitch, the careful word choice that downplayed severity while still conveying seriousness. Around her, passengers began to murmur nervously. A businessman near the window pointed outside, where smoke was visible trailing from the port engine. "That doesn't look minor," Martinez observed, his military training evident in his calm assessment of the situation. Riley unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, ignoring the immediate protests from nearby passengers and flight attendants. "Ma'am, you need to remain seated," called Sarah, the senior flight attendant who had defended her earlier. "That's not smoke," Riley said, moving toward the window for a better view. "That's hydraulic fluid. The port engine is losing pressure, which explains the vibration during climb-out." She turned to Sarah. "I need to speak with Captain Torres immediately. He needs to know what he's dealing with." "I'm sorry, but passengers aren't allowed in the cockpit during flight operations." Riley pulled out her retired military ID card, the one that still carried her clearances for classified information. "I'm not just a passenger. I'm a qualified helicopter pilot with extensive experience in aircraft emergency procedures. And unless I'm mistaken, Captain Torres is about to need all the help he can get." Through the aircraft's structure, she could feel the subtle changes that indicated Phoenix was already implementing emergency procedures, reducing power to the affected engine, beginning a controlled Time was running short, and she was the only person on the aircraft who might be able to help him remember the procedures that could save everyone's life. The aircraft shuddered as Phoenix reduced power to the port engine, and Riley could feel the subtle shift in the aircraft's balance as he compensated with the starboard engine and flight controls. He was handling the situation correctly, but she could sense the growing strain on the remaining systems. "Sarah," Riley said urgently, "Captain Torres needs to know that a hydraulic failure in this aircraft type can cascade into multiple system failure. I've seen it happen in military variants of this same airframe." Sarah looked uncertain, clearly torn between regulations and the growing severity of the situation. Around them, passengers were beginning to panic, as the aircraft's abnormal flight characteristics became more pronounced. "The captain has everything under control," Sarah said, but her voice carried no conviction. "No, he doesn't," Riley replied firmly. "He's flying blind right now, making decisions based on standard procedures for a single engine failure. But if this is what I think it is, those procedures won't be sufficient." She could see the fear growing in passengers' faces as the aircraft continued its irregular flight pattern. Phoenix was clearly struggling to maintain stable flight, probably dealing with multiple system warnings and trying to determine which airport could handle an emergency landing. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," called Jessica from the front of economy, but her voice was drowned out by a sudden metallic groan from somewhere deep in the aircraft's structure. Riley ignored the flight attendant and moved toward the front of the cabin. "I'm going to that cockpit whether you escort me or not. Captain Torres is about to face a situation that could kill everyone on this aircraft, and I'm the only person here who's dealt with it before." Martinez stood up from his seat. "I'll help clear the way if you need it." Other passengers were watching the exchange with growing alarm, but Riley's calm authority in the face of the emergency was beginning to override their panic. "Sarah," Riley said directly to the senior flight attendant, "in about 30 seconds Captain Torres is going to lose partial flight control as the hydraulic failure affects the primary control surface. When that happens, he's going to need someone who understands the manual override procedures for this aircraft type." As if summoned by her words, the aircraft lurched violently to the left, throwing passengers against their armrests. The lights flickered, and somewhere in the cabin, someone screamed. "That's the secondary hydraulic system failing," Riley said grimly. "Phoenix has maybe 5 minutes before this becomes uncontrollable." Sarah's training finally overcame her hesitation. "Follow me," she said, moving rapidly toward the cockpit. "But if the captain says no, you're going back to your seat." As they approached the cockpit door, Riley could hear the urgent radio communications between Phoenix and air traffic control. His voice was still professionally controlled, but she could hear the strain beneath the surface. "Tower, United 84-7 declaring emergency. We have multiple hydraulic failures, and need immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. Riley reached for the cockpit door handle, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether Phoenix remembered the procedures that could save them all. Riley knocked firmly on the cockpit door, not the tentative tap of a nervous passenger, but the authoritative rap of a fellow pilot demanding entry during an emergency. Captain Torres, this is Captain Riley Chen, Army Aviation. I need to assist with your hydraulic emergency. The cockpit door opened immediately, revealing Phoenix's co-pilot, a young woman with captain's stripes who looked both relieved and confused to see military assistance. Captain, there's a passenger who says she's qualified to help, the co-pilot called back to Phoenix. Phoenix turned in his seat, and for a moment, the crisis was forgotten as 5 years collapsed between them. Riley saw the same sharp features she remembered, but now marked by thin scars across his forehead, evidence of his own crash and recovery. Angel 7, Phoenix breathed, using her old call sign. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, his hands momentarily frozen on the flight controls. Phoenix 2-6, Riley replied, moving into the cockpit without invitation. Still getting yourself into trouble, I see. The co-pilot looked between them in confusion. You two know each other. She saved my life, Phoenix said simply, then snapped back to the immediate crisis as another warning light illuminated on the instrument panel. Riley, we've lost primary and secondary hydraulic. I'm down to manual reversion on flight controls. Riley slipped into the jump seat behind them, her eyes scanning the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. Time to failure on remaining systems? Unknown. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe I'm trying to reach Denver, but I'm not sure I can maintain controlled flight that long. Riley studied the hydraulic system displays, her memory automatically accessing procedures she had learned during cross-training on similar military aircraft. You need to start bleeding off speed and altitude now. Get her as slow and low as you can while you still have partial control. That goes against manual procedures for engine-out approach, the co-pilot protested. Manual procedures assume you have working hydraulics, Riley replied. Without them, speed is your enemy. Every mile per hour you carry into the approach makes the aircraft harder to control. Phoenix was already implementing her suggestions, his trust in her judgment absolute. Tower, United 84-7, requesting immediate descent to 8,000 feet, and vectors for straight-in approach to longest available runway. United 84-7, cleared immediate descent to 8,000 feet. Runway 34, right is your longest available at 12. Riley could see Phoenix's hands working constantly on the flight controls, fighting to maintain stable flight as the aircraft's systems continued to degrade. You're over-controlling, she observed. Small inputs like you're flying a helicopter in gusty winds. Phoenix adjusted his technique, and immediately the aircraft's flight path smoothed slightly. Better, but I can feel her getting heavier. Through the cockpit windows, Riley could see Denver International Airport in the distance. It looked impossibly far away, and she knew that every mile would be a battle against an aircraft that was becoming less controllable by the minute. Phoenix, she said quietly, remember what you taught me about impossible approaches. Sometimes you have to trust the aircraft to do things the manual says it can't do. He glanced back at her, understanding immediately. They were about to attempt an approach that would require everything they had learned about flying and survival. United 84-7, be advised emergency equipment is standing by, came the air traffic controller's voice. You're cleared to land any runway. Wind is calm. Phoenix acknowledged the transmission while fighting to maintain control as the aircraft ascended through. The manual reversion flight controls required constant pressure and adjustment, turning what should have been a routine approach into an exhausting battle against physics. Hydraulic pressure is 0 across all systems, the co-pilot reported. We're purely manual from here. Riley watched Phoenix's technique, seeing the subtle signs of fatigue in his movements. You need to let the aircraft find its own attitude, she advised. Fight the instinct to overcorrect. Easy for you to say, Phoenix replied through gritted teeth. You're not the one trying to land a 180,000-pound aircraft with no power assist. Through the cockpit windows they could see the airport growing larger, but their rate of descent was steeper than optimal. Riley calculated their approach angle and realized they were coming in too fast and too high. You need to extend landing gear now, Riley said. Use the drag to help slow us down. Gear won't extend normally without hydraulics, the co-pilot replied, consulting her emergency check. Manual extension, Riley and Phoenix said simultaneously, their shared knowledge of emergency procedures evident. As Phoenix initiated the manual gear extension, Riley addressed the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Chen speaking from the cockpit. We're approaching Denver International Airport for an emergency landing. The aircraft is under control,
but I need everyone to follow the flight crew's instructions exactly." Her calm, authoritative voice seemed to settle the cabin, passengers recognizing competence even in crisis. "Gear down and locked," the co-pilot reported. "But we're still too fast." Riley leaned forward, studying the approach path. "Phoenix, remember the night extraction at Chapman? When you had to land that damaged Chinook with no hydraulics? That was different. This is a commercial aircraft with 200 passengers. The physics are the same. Trust your instinct." Phoenix made a subtle adjustment to his approach, allowing the aircraft to settle into what felt like an unstable descent but was actually the most controlled path available given their circumstances. "Flaps?" the co-pilot asked. "Negative," Riley said before Phoenix could respond. "Without hydraulic assist, they'll deploy asymmetrically and make the aircraft uncontrollable." Through the windscreen, the runway was approaching rapidly. Riley could see emergency vehicles positioned along the taxiways, their lights flashing in preparation for a crash land. "United 847, you appear to be coming in steep and fast," the controller observed. "Understood," Phoenix replied. "We're committed to this approach." Riley gripped her seat restraints, knowing that the next 60 seconds would determine whether Phoenix's skills and her guidance could overcome the aircraft's mechanical failures. 500 feet, the co-pilot called out. Airspeed. The runway filled their vision, approaching faster than any normal landing, but Phoenix's hands remained steady on the controls. 200 feet, the co-pilot announced, her voice tight with stress. Airspeed. 1. Phoenix's hands moved constantly on the flight controls, making minute adjustments to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway center line. Without hydraulic assistance, every input required physical strength that was slowly draining his reserves. "You're doing perfect," Riley said quietly. "Just like Chapman, except this time you get to walk away." The runway threshold passed beneath them at 160 knots, nearly twice normal landing speed. Phoenix pulled back on the controls, trying to arrest their descent while maintaining directional control. The main landing gear struck the runway with tremendous force, sending shockwaves through the aircraft's structure. Passengers screamed as the plane bounced back into the air, momentarily airborne again at 100. "Stay with it," Riley urged as Phoenix fought to control the second touchdown. The aircraft slammed down again, this time staying on the runway as Phoenix deployed the speed brakes and began applying maximum braking pressure. "Brakes are marginal," the co-pilot reported. "Anti-skid system is intermittent." Riley could see they were consuming runway at an alarming rate, their speed still dangerously high as they passed the midfield marker. Emergency vehicles were racing alongside the aircraft, ready to respond if the landing became a crash. "Phoenix, you need to use reverse thrust," Riley said, watching their speed indicator. "Already at maximum reverse," Phoenix replied, sweat visible on his forehead despite the cockpit's climate control. The aircraft finally began to decelerate noticeably as Phoenix's technique and the friction of the runway overcame their momentum. At 3,000 feet from the runway's end, they had slowed to taxi. "United 847, emergency landing complete," Phoenix announced over the radio, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had just fought physics and won. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft as it rolled to a stop. Through the cockpit windows, Riley could see firefighters and paramedics preparing for potential casualties. "Ladies and gentlemen," Phoenix announced over the intercom, "welcome to Denver International Airport. We apologize for the rough landing, but thanks to exceptional skill in our cockpit, and the expertise of Captain Riley Chen, we've arrived safely." The cabin erupted in applause, the sound carrying forward to the cockpit where Riley sat quietly processing what had just happened. "You know," Phoenix said, turning to face her, "I never got to thank you properly for Chapman, for saving my life and the lives of those 43 soldiers." Riley unbuckled her restraints, preparing to leave the cockpit now that the emergency was over. "You just returned the favor. We're even." "No," Phoenix said firmly. "We're not even. What you did at Chapman went beyond duty. What I did today was just my job." The co-pilot looked between them with new understanding. "You're the Captain Chen, from the Medal of Honor citation." Riley paused at the cockpit door. "That's not who I am anymore. I'm just someone who happened to be in the right place when you needed help." But Phoenix's expression suggested he understood exactly who she was, scars and all.
As Riley prepared to leave the cockpit, Phoenix stood and addressed the cabin over the intercom one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, before you disembark, I want you to know exactly what happened today. The woman you see leaving the cockpit is Captain Riley Chen, Medal of Honor recipient. 5 years ago in Afghanistan, she saved my life and the lives of 43 other soldiers during an evacuation under enemy fire. Riley froze at the cockpit door, her back to the cabin, as Phoenix continued. Today, some of you decided that Captain Chen didn't belong in first class because her scars made you uncomfortable. You moved her to the back of the aircraft because her appearance didn't meet your standards for fine dining. The cabin was completely silent now, the weight of Phoenix's words settling over the passengers like a heavy blanket. What you didn't realize is that those scars were earned pulling wounded soldiers from burning helicopters. They were earned leading rescue missions that saved hundreds of lives. And today those same scars were sitting in the last row of this aircraft when Captain Chen came forward and helped me land this plane safely. Riley could hear passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering apologies that would never reach her. Without Captain Chen's expertise in hydraulic system failures, without her knowledge of manual flight control procedures, this landing would have been very different. The woman you judged and rejected based on her appearance just saved your lives. Phoenix's voice grew stronger, more emotional. I want you to think about that the next time you see someone whose scars tell a story you're not comfortable hearing. Because sometimes those scars belong to the person who might save your life. Riley turned back to face the cabin, her scarred features composed despite the attention. She saw faces that had looked at her with disgust hours earlier, now showing shame, gratitude, and something approaching awe. The businessman who had complained about her appearance stood slowly. Captain Chen, I owe you an apology. And apparently much more than that. You owe me nothing, Riley replied quietly. But maybe you'll remember this the next time you see someone who looks different. As she walked down the aisle, passengers reached out to touch her arm, to offer thanks and apology. The same people who had recoiled from her scars now sought connection with her, seeing beyond her appearance to the person beneath. When she reached Martinez, the young soldier who had defended her, he stood at attention. Ma'am, it was an honor to fly with you. The honor was mine, so take care of yourself. As Riley approached the aircraft door, she found Jessica waiting with tears in her eyes. Captain Chen, I'm so sorry. We had no idea who you were. Riley paused, studying the flight attendants. If I had been anyone else, just an ordinary person with scars, would your actions have been different? The question hung in the air as Riley stepped off the aircraft, leaving behind passengers who would never forget the lesson they had learned. 3 weeks later, Riley received an unexpected package at her apartment in Colorado Springs. Inside was a first-class ticket to New York, along with a letter written on United Airlines letterhead. Captain Chen, the letter began, Phoenix Torres here. I've been thinking about our conversation on the flight deck, about finding purpose after survival. I wanted you to know that United Airlines is implementing new training protocols for crew sensitivity based on what happened on our flight. Riley smiled, remembering Phoenix's tendency to turn difficult experiences into teaching moments. More importantly, the letter continued, I'm writing to offer you a position as Chief Safety Officer for United's Emergency Response Training Program. We need someone who understands both the technical aspects of aircraft emergencies and the human factors that determine survival. Riley set the letter down and walked to her window, looking out at the Colorado mountains that had become her refuge after medical retirement. She had been living quietly, avoiding the attention that came with being a decorated veteran, trying to find meaning in a life that no longer included the military service that had defined her. But Phoenix's offer represented something different, a chance to use her knowledge and experience to protect others without hiding who she was or what she had survived. The next morning, Riley called the number at the bottom of the letter. Phoenix, it's Riley. I have some questions about this position. Ask away, Phoenix replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Will I be expected to hide my scars for the comfort of trainees? Absolutely not. In fact, your scars are part of your credibility. They're evidence that you've survived what you're teaching others to handle. Riley considered this. For 3 years, she had struggled with a civilian world that saw her scars as something to be hidden or overcome. Phoenix was offering her a place where they would be seen as qualification. When do I start? 6 months later, Riley stood before a class of United Airlines pilots and flight attendants, teaching emergency procedures that she had learned through experience rather than textbook. Her scars were visible above her uniform collar, but now they served as credentials rather than sources of shame. Emergency situations reveal who we really are, she told her students. Not our appearance, not our backgrounds, but our ability to act under pressure and protect others. In the back of the classroom, Phoenix watched with satisfaction as Riley transformed her survival into service, her trauma into teaching. After class, a young flight attendant approached Riley hesitantly. Captain Chen, I wanted to thank you. Your story helped me understand that heroism doesn't always look like what we expect. Riley smiled, the expression transforming her scarred features. Heroism looks like anyone who chooses to help others, regardless of the cost to them. As she packed up her training materials, Riley reflected on how far she had traveled from that humiliating moment on Flight 84.